In the history of the New York underworld, noise is usually the currency of power. We remember the loud moments, the rattle of a Thompson submachine gun cutting through a quiet night, the explosion of a car ignition wiring a rival boss to his Cadillac, the scream of tires peeling away from a crime scene. Gangsters are loud because they want you to know they are there. They use noise to claim territory. They use noise to announce their arrival. But on June 8, 1962, the most dangerous moment in the history of the American Mafia wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a scream. At exactly 2:47 p.m., on the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, the world stopped because of a slap. It was a sound that traveled faster than a bullet, a sharp, sickening crack of flesh against flesh that cut through the humidity of the Harlem afternoon like a whip. And in the 3 seconds that followed that sound, the fate of the entire Genovese crime family was sealed. They didn't know it yet. The man who delivered the slap didn't know it yet, but the war was already over. To understand the weight of this mistake, you have to understand the heat. It was a Friday, the kind of suffocating, humid New York afternoon where the air feels heavier than the pavement. The thermometer at the corner pharmacy read 94 degrees, but down on the street, between the brownstones and the idling cars, it felt like a furnace. It was the kind of weather that makes patience thin and tempers short, the kind of weather where men make mistakes because their judgment is melting right along with the asphalt. Enter Vincent Terranova. They called him Vinny Slick. He was a soldier for the Genovese family, 34 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than most of the people on that block earned in a year. Vinny was a man who believed that the world belonged to him by birthright. He walked with his chest puffed out, a lit cigarette dangling from his lip, checking his reflection in the shop windows. He was what the old-timers called a cowboy, ambitious, reckless, and desperate to prove that he was a wolf among sheep. He had been sent to Harlem with a simple mandate: squeeze the neighborhood, remind the locals that the 5 families were the true power in New York. And on this particular afternoon, Vinny was looking for a victim. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for a performance. He wanted to make an example of someone, anyone, to show the street that he was the king of the concrete. Then he saw her. Bumpy Johnson was walking out of a grocery store. She was the picture of elegance in a chaotic world, a floral dress, white gloves, a hat perfectly angled against the sun. She moved with a grace that annoyed Vinny. She moved like she didn't care that he was there. She was carrying a simple brown paper bag, minding her own business, living her life. To Vinny, she was just an obstacle, just another local who needed to be taught a lesson in hierarchy. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He expected her to flinch. He expected her to apologize. He made a comment, something crude, something demanding. He wanted her to look at him with fear. He wanted her to acknowledge his power. But Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. She simply tried to step around him. She treated him not like a threat, but like a nuisance, like a fly buzzing at a picnic. And that indifference broke him. Vinny Terranova couldn't handle being ignored. In his mind, if you weren't afraid of him, you were insulting him. His ego, fragile as glass, shattered in that split second of silence. So, without thinking, without checking who she was, without pausing to read the energy of the street, he made the decision that would end his career. He raised his hand, and he struck her across the face. The impact was shocking. It wasn't a push or a shove. It was a violation, an open-handed slap in the middle of a crowded street in broad daylight. And then, silence. The hum of the traffic seemed to vanish. The conversations on the corner ceased. The teenager drinking a soda stopped mid-swallow. The old men playing checkers on the stoop froze. Every pair of eyes on 125th Street turned to Vinny Terranova. Vinny stood there, panting, his hand stinging from the impact. He looked around the circle of faces, waiting for the payoff. He was waiting for the submission. He expected the crowd to scatter. He expected them to lower their heads and scurry away, afraid that they would be next. He puffed his chest out further, waiting for the fear. But he didn't see fear. He saw pity. He saw a shopkeeper shaking his head slowly, closing his eyes as if he couldn't bear to watch what was coming next. He saw a young man looking at him with the same expression you give a man who has just unknowingly stepped off a cliff. The silence wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of people holding their breath because they knew the executioner had just been summoned. Because Vinny Terranova hadn't just slapped a woman. He hadn't just assaulted a civilian. He had put his dirty hands on the Queen of Harlem. He had struck the wife of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson. The name alone was enough to change the temperature in a room. The Grandmaster, the man who read Shakespeare and Machiavelli, the man who had fought Dutch Schultz to a standstill, the man who didn't just run the neighborhood. He was the neighborhood. Vinny looked back at Mamie. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't dropped to her knees begging for mercy. She stood perfectly still, her hand slowly rising to touch the red mark forming on her cheek. Her eyes were not filled with tears. They were filled with calculation. She looked at Vinny the way a scientist looks at a specimen in a jar. She was memorizing him. She was recording the shape of his nose, the color of his tie, the sweat on his brow. She stood there for 10 seconds, 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. And then she did the one thing Vinny couldn't understand. She picked up her grocery bag, adjusted her hat, and walked away. She didn't say a word. She didn't threaten him. She just left. Vinny stood alone on the corner, the king of nothing. He felt a chill run down his spine, despite the 94-degree heat. He told himself he had won. He told himself she ran away because she was scared. He went back to his social club, poured himself a drink, and laughed about it with the other soldiers. He thought the trap was the slap. He thought the interaction was over. But he was wrong. The slap wasn't the end. It was the beginning. While Vinny was celebrating his victory, Bumpy Johnson was sitting in his office above Small's Paradise. He wasn't loading guns. He wasn't calling a hit squad. He wasn't screaming in rage. Bumpy Johnson was doing something far more terrifying. He was sitting in the dark, perfectly calm, organizing a surveillance operation that would rival the CIA. Gangsters use violence to send a message. Bumpy Johnson was about to use capacity. He was about to teach the Genovese family that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a gun. It's a camera lens. And it's the knowledge that you can touch everything a man loves without him ever seeing you coming. Vinny Terranova woke up that morning thinking he was a predator. By sunset, he was the most hunted man in New York City, and he wouldn't even know it for another 72 hours. This is not a story about a gang war. This is a story about the horror of being watched. This is the untold story of the slap, the album, and the day the mob learned to fear the quiet. If you want to understand how one man defeated an army without firing a single shot, you need to listen closely. Subscribe now. Because we are about to open the file on the silent execution to understand why a man like Vincent Terranova would commit suicide on a public street corner. We have to rewind the clock. We have to look at the map of New York City not as a collection of boroughs, but as a chessboard. In 1962, the Genovese crime family was the most powerful criminal organization in America. They didn't just run rackets, they ran the economy of the night. From the docks of Red Hook to the garment district in Manhattan, if money changed hands in the dark, the Genovese family took a percentage. They were corporate, they were efficient, and by the early 60s they had convinced themselves of a dangerous lie. They believed they owned Harlem. For years, the relationship between the Italian five families and the black underworld had been complicated. It was a marriage of convenience held together by greed and segregated by a brutal, unspoken line at 110th Street. The Italians provided the political protection, the judges, and the police captains. The black numbers runners provided the cash flow, millions of dollars in nickels and dimes gathered from the pockets of the working poor. But by 1962, the dynamic was shifting. The Genovese leadership, men like Tony Ducks Corallo, looked at Harlem and didn't see partners anymore. They saw subjects. They saw a gold mine that they wanted to privatize. They had begun a slow, aggressive campaign to push out the independent black operators and install their own men like Vinnie Terranova, to oversee the collection. They called this strategy the golden handcuffs. The logic was simple. You don't need to conquer a neighborhood if you can just buy it. They flooded the avenues with Italian coin-operated jukeboxes. They took over the linen services for the restaurants. They muscled in on the delivery unions. They created a web of debt and dependency that made them feel invincible. They looked at the ledger books and saw that the money was flowing up from 125th Street down to Greenwich Village without interruption. And because the money was flowing, they stopped paying attention to the people. This is where Vinnie's arrogance was born. It wasn't just his personality. It was institutional. He had been trained to view Harlem as a colony. He saw the residents not as citizens with dignity, but as assets on a balance sheet. He believed that the power structure was absolute. In his mind, the Genovese family was the Roman Empire, and Harlem was just a province to be taxed. But there was a flaw in their math, a variable they had stopped calculating for. They forgot about Bumpy Johnson. By 1962, Bumpy was in his 50s. He had spent years in prison. To the young Italian soldiers like Vinnie, Bumpy was a legend, sure, but a legend from the past, a dinosaur. They saw a man who played chess in his office. They saw a man who wrote poetry. They saw a man who was quiet. And in the mob's world, quiet equals weak. Quiet equals retired. The Genovese hierarchy made a fatal assumption. They assumed that because Bumpy wasn't shooting up social clubs every week, he'd been domesticated. They thought they had him contained. They thought that by allowing him to operate his few remaining rackets, they were doing him a favor. They viewed him as a figurehead, a mascot of a bygone era who was allowed to exist only because the Italians were gracious enough to let him. This was the vulnerability that Vinnie Terranova was banking on. He looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw an old man who had lost his teeth. He thought the era of the fierce knife-wielding enforcer who went to war with Dutch Schultz was over. He thought Bumpy was just a tired old king sitting on a crumbling throne, too afraid of going back to Alcatraz to make a move. It was a profound misunderstanding of power. Bumpy hadn't gone soft. He had evolved. While the Italians were focused on brute force and territory, Bumpy had become a student of the human condition. He understood something the mobsters never would. You don't control a neighborhood by breaking legs. You control it by being the gravity that holds it together. Bumpy was the bank for people who couldn't get loans. He was the grocery money for widows. He was the scholarship fund for kids going to college. He wasn't just a gangster. To the people of Harlem, he was the Department of Justice, the Treasury, and the Supreme Court all rolled into one man. The Italians saw the rackets, Bumpy saw the community. The Italians saw fear, Bumpy saw loyalty. So when Vinnie Terranova stepped onto 125th Street that afternoon, he wasn't just stepping onto a sidewalk. He was stepping into a living organism that breathed and moved at Bumpy Johnson's command. Vinnie thought his badge of membership in the Genovese family was a shield. He didn't realize it was actually a target. He mistook Bumpy's silence for submission. He didn't understand that Bumpy had moved beyond the need for noise. A man who has to shout to be heard is a man who fears he isn't being listened to. Bumpy Johnson never shouted. He whispered. And when he whispered, buildings fell down. This was the trap. The Genovese, Family thought they had Harlem in golden handcuffs, locked down, paid off, and under control. They were so busy looking at their profits that they didn't notice the man sitting in the office above the paradise, quietly filing away their secrets. They didn't notice that the handcuffs weren't on Harlem, they were on them. And on June 8th, Vinny Terranova was about to find out that the key to those handcuffs had just been thrown away. The most effective torture device ever invented isn't a rack or a branding iron. It is the human imagination. And Bumpy Johnson knew exactly how to wind that mechanism until it snapped. For 72 hours following the incident on 125th Street, Harlem went dark. Vinny Terranova sat in his social club in the village, surrounded by armed guards waiting for the retaliation. He checked his watch. He checked the door. Every time a car backfired, he jumped. Every time the phone rang, the room went silent. The Genovese family was ready for a war. They had soldiers sleeping on mattresses in the back rooms. They had weapons stashed in the ceiling tiles. They were prepared for noise. But the noise never came. Friday turned into Saturday. Saturday turned into Sunday. The sun rose and set over Harlem, and there was no drive-by shooting. There was no firebombing. There was no declaration of war. Just a thick, suffocating silence. By Monday night, Vinny began to relax. The arrogance returned. He told his captain, "The old man is finished." He took the slap and he swallowed it. He's scared of us. Vinny convinced himself that Bumpy's silence was cowardice. He believed he had called the bluff of the king of Harlem and won. He went home to his wife and children in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, believing that the storm had passed. He didn't know that the storm was already inside his house. June 12, 1962, Tuesday morning, 4 days after the slap. The scene was aggressively normal. Vinny was sitting at his kitchen table drinking espresso. The smell of bacon and toast filled the air. His wife, Angela, was packing lunchboxes. His 2 children were arguing over a comic book. It was the sanctuary of the American dream, a fortress of domestic safety miles away from the grid of 125th Street. At 7:30 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Vinny didn't reach for his gun. Why would he? It was morning in a quiet neighborhood. He walked to the door, opened it, and found a courier standing there. No name tag, no uniform. Just a man in a gray coat holding a package wrapped in brown paper, roughly the size of a shoebox. "Delivery for Vincent Terranova," the man said. Vinny signed for it. He took the box. It wasn't heavy. He carried it into his study, away from the noise of the children. He cut the twine. He peeled back the paper. Inside, there was no bomb. There was no dead fish wrapped in a newspaper. There was just a book, a high-quality leather-bound photo album, the kind you use for wedding memories or baby pictures. The leather was expensive, the grain deep and rich. It smelled like a library. Vinny sat down. He opened the cover. The first page didn't show a wedding. It showed a church, specifically St. Mary's Star of the Sea in Brooklyn. The photo was black and white, grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. In the center of the frame, walking down the steps, was an elderly woman holding a rosary. It was Vinny's mother, Rosa. The timestamp in the corner read, Sunday, 10:15 a.m. Vinny's breath hitched. Sunday. That was 2 days ago. While Vinny was hiding in his club waiting for a war, someone had been sitting across the street from his mother's church, watching her pray. He turned the page. The second photo was taken from the interior of a car. It showed a grocery store window. Through the glass, you could clearly see a woman inspecting melons. She was laughing. It was his wife, Angela. The timestamp read, Monday, 2:40 p.m. The silence in Vinny's study became deafening. The sounds of his children playing in the next room seemed to fade away, replaced by the rushing blood in his ears. This wasn't just surveillance. This was a map of his heart. He turned the page again, his hands starting to tremble. The third photo was the one that broke him. It was a picture of a schoolyard. PS 58. The angle was high, taken from a rooftop or a second-story window across the street. In the crosshairs of the lens, 2 children were walking through the gate, his son, his daughter. They were holding hands. But it wasn't just the photo, it was the detail. The photographer had waited until the crossing guard stepped away. The path to the children was clear. The implication was nauseatingly obvious. We could have taken them. We could have taken them right then, and you wouldn't have known until dinner time. Page after page, the bridge club, the piano lesson, the barber shop, the entire infrastructure of Vinny's life had been infiltrated. While he was bragging about Bumpy being finished, Bumpy's ghosts had been walking alongside his family, breathing the same air, standing close enough to touch them. On the final page, there were no photos, just a single index card with handwriting in elegant cursive script. It didn't scream. It didn't use profanity. It simply said, "You put your hands on my wife in public. I could have put my hands on everyone you love in private. I didn't because I am not you. Leave Harlem today. If you come back, this album becomes an instruction manual." Vinny closed the book. He looked at the door of his study. He looked at the hallway where his children were putting on their shoes. For the first time in his life, Vincent Terranova understood the true definition of power. Power isn't a gun. A gun is a tool for the weak. A gun says, "I can hurt you right now." Power is capacity. Power is demonstrating that you could have destroyed a man's entire world 3 days ago, but you chose not to. It is the difference between OE, threat, and a mercy. Bumpy Johnson had held Vinny's soul in the palm of his hand, weighed it, and decided to give it back to him. Vinny didn't call his captain. He didn't call his crew. He sat there for 5 minutes, shivering in the safety of his own home. He realized that the walls of his house were made of paper. He realized that the Genovese family couldn't protect him from a man who could turn invisible. He stood up. He walked to the kitchen. He told his wife they were going on a vacation. He packed a bag. By noon, Vinny Terranova was gone. He never stepped foot on 125th Street again. And the Genovese family? When the album eventually made its way up the ladder to Tony Duck's, the reaction was not anger. It was silence. They looked at the photos, they looked at the precision, and they realized that Bumpy Johnson had checkmated them without moving a single pawn. He had dismantled their soldier not by breaking his legs, but by breaking his mind. Vincent Terranova's retreat wasn't just a personal failure, it was a geopolitical earthquake. When the album was finally placed on the desk of the Genovese leadership, the room went quiet. These were men who had ordered executions, sanctioned wars, and corrupted unions. They were used to blood. But looking at those photographs, looking at the precise clinical documentation of a soldier's private life, they felt something they hadn't felt in years. They felt exposed. The genius of Bumpy Johnson's move wasn't just that he scared Vinny. It was that he trapped the entire Genovese family in a logical paradox, a zugzwang, a chess term where every move you make worsens your position. Think about it. If the Genovese family retaliated against Bumpy for threatening Vinny, they would have to admit why the threat was made. They would have to admit to the other 5 families that one of their soldiers had slapped an unarmed woman in broad daylight. In the code of the old-school Mafia, the code of omerta and honor, assaulting a civilian woman was a sign of weakness. It was messy, it was undisciplined. It made them look like street thugs instead of businessmen. But if they didn't retaliate, then they were accepting that a black gangster from Harlem had successfully dictated terms to the Italian Mafia. Bumpy had boxed them in. He had used their own rules against them. By responding with gentlemanly surveillance instead of savage violence, he had taken the moral high ground. He forced them to swallow the insult because the alternative was a public relations disaster. Within 2 weeks, a quiet directive was issued from Greenwich Village. There was no memo, nothing written down. But the word went out to every captain, every soldier, and every associate operating north of 110th Street. Operations in Harlem are to be conducted with respect. No freelance intimidation, and under no circumstances, none, is anyone to engage with Ellsworth Johnson or his family without direct approval from the top. It was a complete tactical retreat. The golden handcuffs had been picked. For the rest of his life, Vincent Terranova became a ghost story. He didn't die that day, but the man he was, the arrogant, strutting Vinny Slick, ceased to exist. He lived the rest of his years looking over his shoulder, checking the rear-view mirror, waking up in a cold sweat, wondering if the camera shutter he heard in his dreams was real. He had learned the hardest lesson of the underworld. The loudest man in the room is usually the first one to fall. And for Bumpy Johnson, the legend only grew. The story of the album was whispered in pool halls, barbershops, and prison yards for decades. It became a parable. It changed the way the game was played in Harlem. Before the album, power was measured by how many bodies you dropped. After the album, power was measured by how much you knew. Bumpy had demonstrated a new kind of warfare. Asymmetrical, psychological. He showed that you don't need an army to defeat an empire. You just need to know where the empire sleeps. He proved that violence is temporary. A bruise heals, a bone knits. But awareness? Awareness is permanent. Once you know you are being watched, you are never truly alone again. In the end, Bumpy Johnson protected his wife's honor without spilling a single drop of blood. There were no funerals. There were no police investigations. There was just a leather-bound book and a message that echoed louder than any gunshot. In Harlem, there are lines you do not cross. There are people you do not touch. And if you are foolish enough to forget that, you won't get a war. You won't get a fight. You will just get a package in the mail. And by the time you open it, it will already be too late. This has been the untold mob chronicle of the silent execution. If you believe that true power moves in silence, hit that like button. And if you want to know what happened when the CIA tried to recruit the Mafia, click the video on your screen now. The files are open.